The Importance of Being Earnest is a light-hearted romp through Victorian England, where the upper class spends their days changing their names and making a mockery of everyone and everything. Oscar Wilde's three-act play gives us a tale of love, deception, and an inexplicable obsession with cucumber sandwiches. Because, really, who needs complex plot when you can have a cucumber sandwich? The play is set in the present, or at least the present of 1895. There's this guy named Algernon, or Algy as he's sometimes called. Either way, it's not really a great name. Algernon is a somewhat wealthy man, a bachelor, who intends to stay that way. He doesn't accept blame for anything, and he sees himself as better than most people. Algernon is expecting his aunt and his cousin. He has Lance, his servant, make some cucumber sandwiches because his aunt loves them. While he munches on his aunt's sandwiches, his friend Ernest visits unexpectedly. Algernon asks Ernest what brings him to town, to which Ernest replies, "Oh, pleasure, pleasure. What else should bring one anywhere?" It looks like Ernest is a bit of a man of leisure himself. Ernest tries to eat one of the cucumber sandwiches, but Algernon refuses to let him because, they're for his aunt. We find out that Ernest is in town to ask Gwendolen, Algernon's cousin, to marry him. Algernon says, "I thought you came up for pleasure. I call that business." Algernon tells Ernest that he's not going to marry Gwendolen because the two of them flirt with each other, and he says, "Girls never marry men they flirt with. Girls don't think it right." What good news for Ernest, because she's coming to lunch with her mother, Algernon's aunt. But bad news for Ernest is Algernon says that he's not going to consent to them marrying. Are these guys really friends? Algernon explains that he can't consent to their marriage until Ernest clears up an inscription that is on a cigarette case Ernest left there the previous time they visited. That's what friends do, right? They keep your case so that they can use it against you at just the right moment, rather than give it back to you the moment they find it. The inscription is from someone named Cecily, and is to someone named Jack. Ernest gives really stupid explanations as to the inscription on the cigarette case. I guess we can see why he's secretive about himself. Also, he's a horrible liar, or at least he can't think on his feet. It turns out Ernest's real name is Jack, and he made up a twin brother named Ernest. Why would anybody do this, you ask? Well, it turns out that life is difficult for Jack, and sometimes he wants to come to the city and behave in an, ungentlemanly-like way. For those times, he pretends to be Ernest. Well, what a surprise! Algernon does something very similar. Algernon made up a friend he calls Bunbury, who is terribly ill. Whenever he wants to get out of some obligation, he claims his friend is sick and that he needs to go visit him. Oscar Wilde called this Bunburying, and it actually became part of the lexicon for a while. You can actually still find it in a dictionary today. Then Aunt Augusta and Gwendolen Fairfax, Algernon's cousin, arrive. Aunt Augusta asks for the cucumber sandwiches that Algernon promised her, but would you know it, there are no more sandwiches. Unlike Ernest, Lance is great at thinking on his feet and claimed there were no cucumbers at the market, so he wasn't able to make the sandwiches. More bad news for Aunt Augusta. Algernon can't come to dinner because his friend Bunbury is sick. Aunt Augusta thinks it's high time Bunbury decide if he's living or dying. Algernon then coaxes his aunt out of the room so Jack can ask Gwendolen to marry him. Jack and Gwendolen profess their love for each other, and they agree to marry. Algernon and his aunt return where Gwendolen announces that they are engaged. It's probably a really good thing that Augusta refuses the engagement, because Gwendolen only wants to marry a man named Ernest, and Ernest isn't Jack's real name. Augusta sends Gwendolen to the carriage, insisting there is no engagement, and then she begins to interrogate Jack. She asks Jack, does he smoke? Jack says yes. Good answer for Aunt Augusta. She says men should know nothing or everything. What do you know, Jack? He knows nothing. Good answer for Aunt Augusta. What are his finances? He has some money, but not overly wealthy. Not such a good answer for Aunt Augusta. Who are his parents? He explains he's adopted. Aunt Augusta doesn't like that at all. This means she isn't sure what his position is in society, and that he needs to find relations that can give him a proper position in society. Then the aunt leaves. With that unfortunate news, Algernon, being such a good friend to Jack, started playing the wedding march on the piano. Well, what do you know? Gwendolen returns. and she and Jack agree to write each other and wait until they can marry, no matter how long that takes or how many other men Gwendolen is forced to marry first. Thinking Algernon can't hear them, Jack gives Gwendolen his address for her to write to him. Of course he can hear the address. I mean, he's in the same room. Algernon is very excited about going bun-bearing now. This is the end of Act 1. Act 2 is set at Jack's country house. We have some new players in this act. Cecily, Jack's ward, Miss Prism, Cecily's teacher and sort of babysitter when Jack's not home, and Dr. Canon Chasuble, who is the local minister who seems to spend a considerable amount of time with Miss Prism. Miss Prism is trying to get Cecily to do her schoolwork, but of course she doesn't want to. In their discussions about memory, Cecily learns that Miss Prism once wrote a story, but that she lost it. Dr. Chasuble enters the garden, and Cecily, desperate to get rid of Miss Prism, claims that Miss Prism has a headache and that a short stroll with Dr. Chasuble would get rid of the headache. Somehow both Prism and Chasuble fall for this ploy, and the two leave on their walk. Now Algernon shows up at Jack's country house, claiming to be Ernest, Jack's brother. Ernest and Jack are supposed to be twins, but I guess they're fraternal twins? What do you know? Algernon decided to go bun-bearing at Jack's country house, and Cecily is his target. During this conversation, Cecily tells Algernon that Jack is going to send him, Ernest, to Australia. Algernon finds the idea of Australia distasteful, and so he tells Cecily he wants her to reform him so he can stay there. Cecily tells Algernon she has no time this afternoon to reform him, so he decides to try to do it himself. Then the two flirt with each other for a while. Prism and Chasuble are deep in conversation when they realize Cecily is not where they left her. So that Cecily can continue speaking to Algernon, Oscar Wilde has Jack enter to distract Prism and Chasuble from looking for her. The two are surprised to see Jack because they thought he wasn't due home for several more days. Jack announces that he's back because his brother Ernest has died. He tells them Ernest died exactly the way Algernon and he discussed it in Act 1. Jack then asks Dr. Chasuble to christen him, and they make an appointment for 5:30 that evening. Right on cue, Cecily enters the house and is surprised to see her uncle home. Dr. Chasuble began consoling her in anticipation of Jack's news of Ernest. With any good drama, though, before Jack can announce Ernest's death, Cecily announced that Jack's brother is there. Oh no, now Jack can't kill him off. Jack declares he doesn't have a brother. Freudian slip much? Dr. Chasuble and Miss Prism are quick to accept that Ernest is alive. They don't even question that Jack could be told of Ernest's death while he's alive. Nope, they just accept everything. Algernon enters pretending to be Ernest. Jack is quite angry at Algernon. Everyone leaves except the two lying liars who argue with each other. Jack leaves to change his clothes and expects Algernon to leave. As Jack leaves, Algernon declares, "I think it has been a great success. I'm in love with Cecily, and that is everything." Wow, that is fast. With Jack gone, Cecily enters the room to continue her conversation with Algernon. Algernon is hoping to set a date to continue his bun-bearing with Cecily. Just a thought. Is it bun-bearing if he wants to see her again because of, feelings? While they're talking, Algernon tells her that he loves her and asks her to marry him. Wow. Wilde moves his characters and the plot very quickly. Cecily tells him, "You silly boy. Of course. Why, we have been engaged for the last 3 months." As you can imagine, this declaration comes as quite a surprise to Algernon. They've apparently had a lengthy relationship in Cecily's imagination. This engagement is so real in her mind that she even bought a ring that she wears to show her promise of marriage to Ernest. She even wrote letters to herself in Ernest's name. She even imagined an argument that they had at one point, causing a temporary end to their engagement. She wrote in her diary, "Today I broke off my engagement with Ernest. I feel it is better to do so. The weather still continues charming." Algernon is somewhat hurt by the notion that their engagement had been broken off. He says, "But why on earth did you break it off? What had I done? I had done nothing at all." Cecily, I'm very much hurt indeed to hear you broke it off, particularly when the weather was so charming. Cecily, of course, gave the most logical answer. She said, "It would hardly have been a really serious engagement if it hadn't been broken off at least once, but I forgave you before the week was out." Cecily tells Algernon that one of the reasons she wants to marry him is, can you guess? His name, Ernest. Like Jack with Gwendolen, he tries to convince Cecily that the name shouldn't be important. Like Gwendolen, Cecily is undeterred in her desire to marry a man named Ernest. Well, what is Algernon to do? Obviously go to Dr. Chasuble and ask to be christened that day. Uh-oh, Gwendolen shows up. Cecily entertains Gwendolen as Jack is not available. When Cecily introduces herself to Gwendolen, Gwendolen tells her, "Something tells me that we are going to be great friends. I like you already, more than I can say. My first impressions of people are never wrong." But then confusion sets in. Gwendolen thinks Cecily is Ernest Ward. Cecily clears things up for Gwendolen and says she's Jack's ward and Ernest's fiancée. Now, there is more confusion than ever. The two think they are Ernest's true fiancé and that Ernest must be saved from the other one. Uh-oh, I think their friendship is on shaky ground. They take some time to make veiled insults at each other. Gwendolen tells her, "From the moment I saw you, I distrusted you. I felt that you were false and deceitful. I am never deceived in such matters. My first impressions of people are invariably right." Luckily for the ladies, Jack enters before the two manage to come to blows. Now the two ladies are utterly confused. Is he Jack or is he Ernest? Before they can work out their confusion, Algernon enters. The two men must admit their deceptions. The women now are best friends again. Nay, they see themselves as sisters. Jack is forced to admit that he has no brother, let alone one named Ernest. The ladies realize that they've never been engaged, and they go into the house expecting the men would not follow them. Left alone, the men discuss the situation. Jack is distressed about it, but Algernon is quite happy with the situation. Each thinks it's good that the other can no longer deceive everyone. They're also offended by each other's deception perpetrated on the ladies. I mean, why look inwardly at your mistakes when you can get mad at someone else for doing the exact same thing? Also, they're still determined to be christened as Ernest, hoping they can salvage their engagements. This is the end of Act 2. This act continues at Jack's country house. The act begins with the ladies talking about how the men must feel shame because they didn't follow them into the house and they are eating muffins. Because we all know men eating muffins equals shame. After a few moments, they see that the men are coming into the house and they agree not to speak first. When the men come in, Gwendolen immediately tells Jack she has a question for him. Then Cecily follows by asking Algernon why he pretended to be Jack's brother. What a way to stick to your guns there, girls. The men say they lied to be able to spend time with the ladies, and the ladies are satisfied with their answers. However, the ladies still have a problem with their names. Wait, they're okay with those answers, and the only thing they have a problem with is their names? The men tell the ladies that they are each going to be christened that day as Ernest, so their Christian names will be Ernest. The ladies are so moved by the men's sacrifice in changing their names. They all hug their respective fiancés. Their happiness is short-lived, though, because Aunt Augusta appears at Jack's door. Gwendolen and Jack tell Aunt Augusta that they're engaged. Obviously, Aunt Augusta disagrees. Aunt Augusta asks Algernon why he's there. Does Bunbury live there? Algernon declares Bunbury is dead. Aunt Augusta is glad Bunbury finally made up his mind about whether he's going to live or die. Then the aunt notices Cecily and asks who she is. Algernon declares that he's engaged to her. This surprises the aunt, and she interrogates Jack on Cecily's background and her wealth. The aunt was not terribly impressed with Cecily's background, but was quite impressed with Cecily's 13,000 pounds, which is roughly $28 million today. Naturally, Aunt Augusta gives her consent to marriage. Jack, on the other hand, objects to the engagement. He says he doesn't approve of Algernon's moral character and thinks he may be a liar. Maybe a liar? Also, does Jack not have any self-awareness? Jack tells Aunt Augusta of Algernon's deception to get into his house and woo Cecily. Aunt Augusta considers what Jack told her and then reaffirms the engagement. She says, "I have decided entirely to overlook my nephew's conduct to you." Of course she does. She has almost 28 million reasons to overlook it. Jack makes it clear his moral objections could be assuaged if Aunt Augusta agrees for him to marry Gwendolen. Ah, yes. What a great way to get a marriage agreement. Dr. Chasuble enters the room and announces the christenings are all set for that night. But Jack tells Dr. Chasuble that they don't need to be christened now because the engagements are off. Chasuble, of course, is saddened, but he says he should return to the rectory because Miss Prism has been waiting an hour and a half for him. This name catches Aunt Augusta's attention. She asks the doctor, "Is this Miss Prism a female of repellent aspect, remotely connected to education?" To which he responded, "She is the most cultivated of ladies and the very picture of respectability." Aunt Augusta insists she must see Prism at once. Luckily for her, Miss Prism appears in that moment. Aunt Augusta quizzes Prism about a baby she left with 28 years ago. Aunt Augusta hasn't seen either of them since that day. Wait, she lost a baby and then disappeared? She never thought it was a good idea to tell somebody about this? Prism explains that she accidentally put the manuscript she wrote that was mentioned in Act 2 in the baby stroller and the baby in the handbag that was meant for the manuscript. This story gets Jack's attention, and he begged Prism to tell him more about where she deposited the handbag. But Prism doesn't remember. Jack was desperate for details, and based on Prism's answers, Jack left the room and said he would return soon. After some time, Jack returns with the handbag and asks Prism if this was the handbag she had. Prism looks it over and confirms that this is her handbag, and she's very happy to get it back. Jack then told her he was the baby in the handbag. Let me get this straight. Neither Jack nor Cecily ever told Prism Jack's backstory? This information surprised Prism. Then she directed Jack to Aunt Augusta for the answer to who he really is. Aunt Augusta said that baby, who we now know as Jack, is her sister's son and therefore Algernon's older brother. Jack is excited. He actually does have a brother. And then he admonishes Algernon for not treating him with the respect a brother should. Somehow Algernon feels the need to apologize and says, "Well, not till today, old boy, I admit. I did my best, however, though I was out of practice." Gwendolen, of course, only cares about Jack's real name. Neither Aunt Augusta nor Prism could recall, but Aunt Augusta knew that being the oldest, he would have been named after his long-dead father, a name she can't recall. How can you not remember your brother's-in-law name, even if he's been dead for a while? Somehow Algernon also doesn't remember his name. I feel like he should know his father's name. Aunt Augusta believes his father's name should appear in a military directory since he was a general before death. For some reason, Jack happens to have a military directory. He searches the directory and eventually finds his name. Wanna bet what his name was? Jack reads, General, 1869. Christian names, Ernest John. Now, Aunt Augusta remembers his name and says, "Yes, I remember now that the general was called Ernest. I knew I had some particular reason for disliking that name." Jack then asks Gwendolen, "Gwendolen, is it a terrible thing for a man to find out suddenly that all his life he's been speaking nothing but the truth? Can you forgive me?" Gwendolen assures him, "I can, for I feel that you are sure to change." Ernest, hugs Gwendolen. Algernon hugs Cecily, and Chasuble hugs Prism. I guess Cecily has gotten over her need to marry a man named Ernest. Aunt Augusta says to Algernon, "My nephew, you seem to be displaying signs of triviality." To which he responds, "On the contrary, Aunt Augusta, I've now realized for the first time in my life the vital importance of being earnest." The play ends.